Good day, everyone. The next approach we will discuss in this course is new institutionalism. So there will be two main objectives for this part of the course. First is, as usual, to explain the core assumptions of this approach, which is new institutionalism. And next, recognize some of the limitations of this approach in political analysis. So as you have seen in the title for the current recorded lecture, we will be discussing primarily new institutionalism. At this point, I want you to review your notes on the traditional legalistic approach as this pertains to old institutionalism. If you remember, we said that old institutionalism, or the traditional legal approach, is focused only with the study of constitutions or governmental arrangements. Old institutionalism focused on classifying governments. As legalistic language is used in the study of political science, this created the impression that political science can be the best pre-law course for political science students. For this lesson, however, we move on to new institutionalism. We discuss its background, historical background, its strengths and weaknesses, as well as some of the representative works of this approach. So as a review, here are the core characteristics of the old institutionalism approach. Again, you may review your notes on the traditional legalistic approach as these are directly connected. First is the focus on the rules, norms, and values that govern political exchanges. In the study of constitutions and governments, old institutionalism locates politics only in the government. Thus, interactions in this realm is the only concern of old institutionalism. It is focused on rules, such as the Constitution and laws. It is also highly normative, as it is concerned about order and the characteristics of the good. The good government or a good constitution. Second, it is also focused on describing constitutions, legal systems, and government structures. As I have discussed, it is more concerned on the processes and the actual workings of government, like for example, how the Congress passes laws or how the three branches of government relate to each other. So you may remember your quiz and the provisions on the three articles that I asked you to read. Third, one distinct feature of old institutionalism is that it uses the historical comparative method. Historical case studies are mostly used. For example, to study the 1986 Constitution, you need to be able to study or know about its previous versions. The study of the state is a kind of political history. So you will see this again in new institutionalism because it also considers history as a very important part of the approach. And then finally, it describes the political world in non-abstract terms. This is why they are concerned mostly on government institutions, as these are concrete and can be observed. So this was the way political science has been traditionally studied until the 1950s. As we have discussed in previous lessons, in the 1960s, many political scientists rode the wave of the behavioral revolution. Their studies highlight the fact that the locus of politics is not just in the government, as old institutionalism posits, but it is in social processes. Rational choice theory, the last topic, as we have also discussed, changed the way political science is studied by focusing on individual preferences. So in the 1980s, there was this re-emergence of the study of institutions through new institutionalism. Before we define what is new about new institutionalism, however, we need to define what is or what are institutions. So before we start, I want you to think of things that come to your mind when you think about the word institutions. So take note of those words so you can pause and then list the words that you think are related to institutions. Okay, so have you listed down the words that you thought about when you heard the word institution? So to start, first, we can think of the University of the Philippines as an institution. So if you wrote university, the university is indeed an institution. So not just UP, but the term university connotes an institutional setting. Why? So we'll discuss that in a minute. The second icon pops up when you search institution online. Like for example, if when you pause this video, you search institution on Google, this icon will pop up. It is a building. Okay. So next you have this again a building, but there is a dollar sign on top of it. So this is a bank. So there are many banks, but the bank in itself is an institution. So we usually attach the term institution on other words, as in this case, we can consider the bank as a financial institution. So there are many financial institutions. The bank is only one of them. So if the bank and the university and the government are some of the words that you have put, then you're right in saying that they are institutions. But what's common among these ideas or institutions? Okay, so what is common to these three icons or logos here is when we think about them, we think of an actual place. So a building with an aura of formality in it. So when you say institution, by institution, it has an aura of formality. If you thought of a school or the government as examples of institutions, then you're right. If we think about these institutions, we think of an actual location. For example, the halls of your previous high school, okay, or UP Baguio. Or if that's the government, you may be thinking of Malacanang, a city hall, a barangay hall. Okay, we're thinking of actual structures. However, for this lecture and as a social science and political science student, we must go beyond this idea of an institution as an actual location. So why? Because another example of institution is a family. Okay, media is also an institution. The economy also is an institution. These three cannot just be located in one building or one actual location. So what makes these examples institutions? So take note of these examples and keep them in mind as we define further institutions. So from those sample ideas of what an institution is, so keep those in mind, and then when we define now institutions, you think of the ideas that in the definitions of institutions that are related to those examples that we have discussed, such as, the university, a school, a government, okay? Because one key assumption of new institutionalism is that institutions matter. At this point, take note of the fact that we are looking at new institutionalism as to how it understands political phenomena. New institutionalism, as coined by James G. March and Johann P. Olson, acknowledges the crucial mediating role of institutions in shaping political conduct and translating political inputs into political outcomes. This was a response to the claims of rational choice theorists that political behavior and conduct are only based on selfish interests and that human behavior is predictable because of this. For new institutionalists, institutions have a role in political actors' behavior. So, what are institutions anyway? So institutions, according to new institutionalists, are stable, recurring patterns of behavior. It involves formal rules and informal conventions of political life, as well as formal constitutions and organizational structure, values, and power relationships. At first glance, you can see that this is somehow far from how we use the term institution to refer to educational, governmental, and financial institutions, for example. Institution is an abstract concept referring to patterns of behavior and rules as well as norms. In our life in the society, we tend to follow sometimes invisible and uncodified rules based on the setting or context. For example, when we're at school, it makes sense to keep quiet while a teacher teaches in front of a classroom, right? So this applies obviously in a face-to-face setting. In a school, there is also the setup that you enroll, then you study for a year in the case of primary and secondary schools, or for a semester when you're in the university or college. You get a grade every quarter submitted from the activities you submitted, or from if you're in a university every semester, and then you move up to the next grade. So you finish first sem, you move on to the second sem. If you finish first sem, Okay, so these may seem simple, and you may say that everybody knows about this because we already know how a school works. But imagine explaining this to an alien or someone who has not gone to school in their lifetime. In explaining, you must be able to explain the context of the school. Why is there a school in the first place? What do people do inside schools? Are there rules for students, for teachers, for administrators? Okay, so um, those are things that we need to understand first about an institution. It's not a building. Okay, it's not an organization. Okay, it's referring to patterns of behavior, patterns of action, or knowledge even that we know about a certain institution. Okay, so we will try to understand that more in the next few slides. Okay, so let's take more examples because I know this is hard to understand on its own. How would you explain the concept of money to an alien or to someone who does not know what money is? Or traffic lights. Why does red mean stop? Why is green go? Why can't red be go? Or why can't green be stop? So again, these are, in sociology, these are what you call taken for granted knowledge. Okay, but these taken for granted knowledge are actually what makes up institutions. So, for example, traffic lights and money are not exactly institutions, but they're part of institutions. But I want to point out here is that our behavior sometimes can be shaped by certain context, and this behavior is recurring and has a pattern to it. When you follow traffic rules and go on the pedestrian lane when cars stop at the red light, you are actually reinforcing this behavior. As almost, not all, people do it regularly, it becomes a pattern that you are now expected to follow this either as a norm or a rule. When something is a norm, usually people follow because other people do and you are expected to do so. If it's a rule, it may be codified into law or uncodified, but it is considered as an agreement between people anyway. So, when it comes to money, are there norms and rules? Yes, definitely. Especially when you discuss it in the context of an economy, which is an institution reinforced by stable, recurring patterns of behavior and is comprised of formal rules and procedures. Money has a history. It is the way that we exchange value. So if you want, for example, a chair, a gaming chair, then you need, for example, at least there's this brand that is 25,000 pesos. Okay, so you need 25,000 pesos to buy that specific chair. The transaction would not happen if you do not have that kind of money. You would not have that kind of money if you are not given that amount of money or if you do not earn it. You do not earn money if you do not have a job or if your family does not have money. You would not have a job if you do not have skills or a degree. You would not have skills or a degree if you do not study. You would not be able to study if you do not have the resources or you do not know how colleges or universities work. You see, these processes do not just happen on their own. They happen because people do them repeatedly throughout history. These repeated behaviors create institutions, and the created institutions impinge upon us and shape our behavior. So because our ancestors, for example, have established this system of, traffic and transactions about money, then we are enjoined to actually follow them. Because if you don't follow them, like for example, if you just get something and you won't pay for it, then you will actually pay for it because there are codified laws and sometimes norms that would say that your behavior is unacceptable. Okay, so I would repeat it again, that institutions are recurring patterns of behavior. So in this example, money and traffic, they are not institutions, but they are part of the institutions because money, for example, is part of the institution that is the economy. Okay, or for example, financial institutions. Money is involved in financial institutions such as banks. There is the idea of interest. There is the idea of debit, credit, etc. Okay, so those things you cannot know just because you know. Okay? You know because you experience it, you know it, and you are part of those people who are reinforcing these stable, recurring patterns of behavior, which are institutions. Okay? So, more examples so that we can understand this. So, back to the school or the university. The university is an institution that has a history. So, I would not delve into that here, but the concept of a university exists because of stable, recurring patterns of behavior. What behavior? Most universities have criteria when admitting students. For UP, it has always been high school grades and passing the UPCAT. Why is this? Because universities are institutions of higher learning. It is the rule that UPCAT passers can enter UP, and so it has been like this for decades. So, in terms of administration, we can say that the idea of the university exists because people in the administration follow specific guidelines on how to admit students. This preserves the integrity of the institution as one that only admits students who conforms to its standard as a university. While inside the university, students follow the standards of the university, such as, for example, honor and excellence. But in general, universities values independent and ethical research. Thus, you cannot graduate with a specific without a specific number of units and an undergraduate thesis. Why is this so? This is because UP and most universities are research universities. Again, this is a stable, recurring pattern behavior in the part of the students. Students toil for 4 or more years to graduate and get a degree because that is what is expected of them in the university. It is the rule. The expected behavior is they study and pass all their subjects. Fast forward from 1908, the University of the Philippines still stands. After graduation, the society recognizes the degree as an achievement or an acceptable requirement for employment. By respect and recognition of the idea of the university as an institution. You can search about the oldest universities in the world and you will find similar expectations on what a university should be and what are the usual rules for administration and students. This is why it is an institution. So I'm not here to tell you about the history or why the university is the way it is, but because the university is an institution. So it has done the same thing for centuries and continue to do so. Institution does not mean historicity or having history, though that is very important. What I mean here is that for an institution to be an institution, people should be involved in a stable, recurring pattern of behavior that creates or created formal and informal rules and norms that contribute to the posterity of an institution. So again, we said a while ago that the family is an institution. There are expectations for family members, for example, for parents to raise children. There are also expectations based on your order of birth. People do not talk about this or agree, like making a law, but all of us are knowledgeable of these norms and unwritten rules. The society also recognizes this, again because it is comprised of stable, recurring pattern of behavior like parents feeding and clothing their children until they're of legal age, etc. Take note also of context. Because of these patterns of behavior, we are beholden to follow them based on the context. In the university, we are expected to follow its rules as the people who graduated before us. In the Philippines, for example, there's this unwritten rule in the family that because your parents raised you, you're supposed to take care of your parents until they get old. As you can see, these expectations make sense only in the context of the institution involved. Okay, so now that we have these many ideas of institutions, I want to clarify, but that of course, what we are concerned about in political analysis are political institutions. So we said that new institutionalism does not align with rational choice theorists in saying that there is regularity in human behavior. However, new institutionalism, new institutionalism posits that political conduct is shaped profoundly by the institutional context in which it occurs and acquires significance. Here, new institutionalists argue that institutions provide structures for people or political actors involved, and that these structures define their interests. defend and define their interests. For example, again, in the context of the university, it is in the students' interests to demand for fair and transparent grading because in the context of the university, that is what is expected. Thus, their interests are defined by standard operating procedures or what is normally done in a university. Student cannot thus demand that a teacher give them all the same grade. Why? Because of procedure. Okay, so it is also helpful to think of the assumption of institutionalists that institutions not only shape human behavior but constrains it. Rules control and constrain behavior to promote order. Okay, so this is very similar to the government. People can demand transparency because that is expected of officials elected through fair elections. It is within the structure of a democratic government. Thus, the interest of the people is shaped by the institution of the government. However, the government and its rules also constrains people from doing things that are not allowed by law. Citizens, for example, cannot just pass a law, but congressmen can. Congressmen and women can do this, can pass a law. But as you have seen, it is also in the law that we have the initiative, okay, citizens' initiative. Okay, but they cannot just, one citizen that he or she or they want to pass a law, they cannot just do that because it is within the rules. They could, however, pass a referendum, but it is still within the rules that there should be a signatory from every voting district in the country. With this, the interests of people are also constrained within this context. Okay, so even our politicians, they're elected there, but even though how much they want to engage in corrupt behavior, if the system does not condone it, okay, if there are actual rules that that say that they cannot engage in corrupt behavior, I mean, if there are no loopholes in the rules, then they won't be able to do it. Okay, I mean, if there is corruption now, there could be more corruption if there are no rules. But since there are no rules, they are somehow constrained by it. They need to play by the rules. Okay, so in the political institution, in short, you also have these stable, recurring patterns of behavior that in the long run become standard operating procedures. They become the standard in for the people who are belonging there. Okay, so for example, if there's a crisis, then there should be a standard operating procedure, or there should be something in the rules of what the president will do, what the Congress will do. Okay, and mind you, this is not just formal rules. This can also be informal ones. All right. So when we say standard operating procedure, we are also referring to specific rules of behavior that are agreed upon and in general followed by agents, whether explicitly or tacitly agreed. Remember again the university as an institution. Admission based on UPCAT results is a rule because it has been agreed upon by a body of administrators or regents. It is expected that all UP students are UPCAT passers or have gone into the process of transferring because these are codified rules. So this is not just based on feelings of administrators, but it's based on rules. And as I've told you a while ago, it has a history, not just in the University of the Philippines, but in the very institution of the university itself. Thus, it is not just simply a norm or a custom because everybody is enjoined to follow this rule. In the government, of course, you have the Constitution. What is distinct, however, in new institutionalism is that these rules are not just formal, like laws. It also considers that political actors, for example, voters or politicians or parts of the bureaucracy, can be beholden to informal institutions. So if that is the definition of institutions, what then is new institutionalism? So first, it is a set of theoretical ideas and hypotheses concerning the relations between institutional characteristics and political agency, performance, and change. It is an approach in understanding political phenomena. That's why we're studying it. It discusses the characteristics of political institutions in terms of formal and informal rules and standard operating procedures. As a discussion of agency, it talks about the people that reinforces the rules and standard operating procedures inside institutionalism. If rational choice theory focuses on individual behavior, okay, we're in the second now. Institutionalism looks at organizations and their behavior as they are considered as collective political actors. Thus, we can talk about the action of the administration as referring to the Philippine government as one, considering that they all belong to the same organization or institution. The same way that we are usually referred to generally as taga-UP or UPian. Right? So, if in rational choice theory, the main political actor is the individual, in new institutionalism, it is institutions. Okay, institutions or organizations. So one important thing to remember is that what is new in new institutionalism is the fact that it does not only study formal rules like laws or the constitution like old institutionalism as previously discussed. It recognizes that in politics, actors are affected also by informal conventions, and not only formal rules are being followed. Institutions are also comprised of beliefs, paradigms, codes, cultures, and knowledge that could shape actors' behavior inside it. So again, we treat institutions as a structure. So if it's a structure, agency, binary, people and their behavior are shaped within the structure of the institution. Okay, so what the institution wants, sometimes or most of the time, it gets because of the stable recurring patterns of behavior. Because it shapes what you can do, because it has been the way things have been done for so long. Okay, so yeah, so say for example, bidding in the government. Bidding is a formal process. Okay, so it's formal in the sense na makikita nyo yan na sa mga pages ng websites ng mga cities, for example, cities, agencies, yan, may mga call for bids. Okay. Na, for example, kailangan nila ng ano. Have you remember the DepEd issue nung Pasko? Yung kailangan daw nila ng cheese, o queso de bola. Okay. Binibid yan. Hindi bumibili yung gobyerno ng basta-basta lang kung sino yung gusto nilang pagbilhan, because there is a process. Okay, so say for example that the government wants to build a new barangay hall. So the rules say that there should be open bidding for the construction. However, there could be an informal convention or agreement that the kapitan's family member has a construction company and that this company should be contracted by the barangay to build the barangay hall. The barangay can actually tweak the requirements for the bidding so this company by his relative wins. That sounds like corruption, right? Well, it is. It is also an informal convention in some barangays and in many government offices. So maybe if some of you are involved in these affairs, I have seen this actually, not just in field work, okay, but in field work, yeah, I have seen how like this specific barangay's captain, siya mismo yung may kumpanya. Tapos sa kanya napupunta lahat ng mga yung mga contract for example, kailangan nila ng building materials, ganyan. So again, that's not part of the rules, but for most political units, it can be something that you can say na maraming gumagawa nito. Okay? Kasi informal. Alam mo na may mga Pilipino, 'di ba, utang na loob, ganyan. So utang na loob ng mayor doon sa friend niya na businessman nung eleksyon ay binigyan siya ng pondo, ganyan. Tapos nung nasa City Hall na siya na ngayon yung magde-decide na dito na lang kayo bumili ng building materials. Again, that's not a formal rule. It's an informal convention. Okay? Yung family influence, yung example natin sa barangay. So that is the part of new institutionalism. No, it goes beyond the formal rules. It also looks at other informal rules, norms, conventions that could actually shape political behavior. So you do not just look at the rules of bidding, for example. You actually study how the bidding takes place and identify how formal and informal rules shape behavior of individual actors and the organization or the institution itself. So furthermore, new institutionalism is not a theory, but an organizing perspective, as it asserts that institutions are the variable that explain most of political life. So of course, there would be many critiques about this, but new institutionalism, again, like rational choice theory and behavioralism, is just one of the approaches that you can use to look at political phenomena. But of course, for new institutionalism, institutions are the most important part of political life. But you know, if you ask someone who is doing studies on rational choice theory, syempre iba yung sasabihin niya sa'yo. Okay, so new institutionalism. So another key idea of new institutionalism, aside from institutions matter, is that history matters. As I've mentioned previously, history is important in institutionalism. Why? Because history is the way that you could know how institutions came to be and how they continue to persist. Okay. But as early as now, I would say that later in the critique, they will say that even though history matters in institutionalism, they couldn't actually pinpoint the starting point of institutions. Because even in sociology, they would just say that it's based on people reinforcing a certain set of behaviors. Okay, but you cannot actually pinpoint who's the first one who did, for example, who said that this is how university should work. Okay, it's not usually explained, but history still is important. Okay, so our example on the university exemplifies this. The earliest university was established in the year 859, but until now, there are still universities in the world that work in the same way, or at least with the same purpose. In political analysis, we look at politics as a process and not just a thing. Unlike old institutionalism that focuses on politics as a thing in the form of the government, we now focus on the processes of government and how they have changed through time. For example, the idea of protesting has been the same for decades, protesting. But the ways to protest aren't. So for example, in EDSA DOS, the People Power Revolution was mobilized through group messages. So kung naabutan nyo pa yung mga GM, okay, or through texting. Now, students mobilize through messenger GCs, online educational discussions. Okay, so specifically in Hong Kong, because there was censorship and the government has surveillance even on mobile apps, they made an app that lets them communicate through Bluetooth na hindi madedetect ng government. These process of change in protest can also be said about other political phenomena. So history is all about context, specifically temporal and spatial, as well as cultural. Institutions, as well as the rules within them, is characterized by their embeddedness in particular context. So that's a keyword then for institutionalism, embeddedness. For example, if you watch the film On the Basis of Sex, so if you have watched it, good. If you have not watched it, but you do not want to be spoiled, but it's a true to life story, so there's really nothing to spoil. So but if you watch the film On the Basis of Sex, there was a time in the United States when women were just starting to be accepted in law schools. After graduation in Harvard and Columbia, the protagonist, Ruth Ginsburg, wanted to practice law but was not accepted at any law office, not because she lacks the credentials, but because it's just the norm during that time. So one office told her it's because wives of lawyers and partners get jealous when they have women co-workers. The organizations and institutions at that time was embedded in a particular context where gender equality was not still or was not yet recognized in the US Constitution. So if it's not recognized there, in other parts of the world, it also wasn't recognized during that time. So this was the atmosphere or the context of the time. So fast forward to the 90s, Ginsburg became an associate justice at the US Supreme Court until her death. That would not have been possible if the institution stayed the same even though the context changed. The context changed and so did the rules and norms of that institution. So in political analysis, this embeddedness is important as it shows that institutions are processes and not static things. Okay, so if in the 50s, for example, she was able to enroll in Harvard because, the atmosphere or the institutions of the time were changing. That was it at its height in the 1960s. Okay, so if you search the 1960s, these were the height also of student protests, okay, and fights for gender equality. Okay, so in the 90s, okay, it was the peak of this, and now we're living in a world that is at least more tolerant, unlike in the 50s. So we see how this history, um, or how this process has changed institutions themselves. So when the society changes, it has an effect also on institutions. So for example, on political institutions. Okay, so for example, in the case of on the basis of sex on that movie, it was the legal institutions, right? So if we go back to old institutionalism, they just discussed government as if it was not changing. Okay, they define federal and unitary government as if it is applied the same in the world. No, even if you know the basics of the unified and the federal government, the presidential government, the parliamentary government, you will see many different definitions in the literature. Why? Because it has very different applications in many different countries because of different cultures and different contexts. So that produces different institutional contexts. So so this is what new institutionalism tries to nuance as forms of government, though having distinct defining features are applied differently depending on context. So that's one contribution actually of new institutionalism, the embeddedness and the treating of institutions and political processes as dynamic and not static. So another key idea of new institutionalism is path dependence. According to this idea, changes of institutions are basically slow and incremental in nature. Small events may have huge consequences. So once a development is locked onto a certain track, it may well continue on this. Institutions, because these are stable, recurring patterns of behavior. So, paulit-ulit na ako dun sa stable, recurring patterns of behavior, but you should remember that because that's what institutions are. It's difficult to change kasi nga sabi stable and recurring. So take for example the current Philippine government. It is difficult to expect change on their militaristic response to the pandemic because that was how it is since day one. The drug problem that Duterte claims the country has is not just a problem of crime, as we know. There could be a health-focused response to this, but he instead started a purge of addicts and pushers without proper litigation and without the option of rehabilitation. This is parallel to their COVID-19 response that recently the president said is a business problem rather than a medical one. So you can look at the lecture notes for the link of that specific article. Thus, there is a path dependence in Duterte policies as this was the track his administration took since day one. So again, you can see how it's a process. Okay? You cannot just, saka hindi lang sa day one ng Duterte administration, but in the nature of the Philippine government itself. Okay, look at how they have, but the militaristic response is syempre, very distinct to him, specifically in the COVID setting. So as you can see, this is becoming long because this topic is long and really hard to discuss in a few words only. Okay, because yeah, so if you need the breather, you can just pause it and move on later on. Okay, so one key assumption again of new institutionalism is that political systems are complex and inherently unpredictable. Why? Even though there are rules and norms inside institutions, these change. In an institution, there could be divisions that have different goals or different preferences on who is involved in decision making. Institutions are never fully closed or complete because of people, and it allows for variation and standardization. So this means that, for example, even though we can refer to the Duterte administration as such, we do not actually think that every single one in his cabinet or his allies think the same way, even though that may actually be the case. There are rules, formal and informal, but these can also be subverted. Like right now, some of his allies are now criticizing his pandemic response, either because it has been more than a year of lockdown or because they are seeking to be re-elected next year. So, as you can see, even though the institution or institutions are structures that supposedly shapes political behavior or behavior of political actors, we must take into consideration that the political actors are human, okay, and they could have other interests, okay. They could have other interests, or they could actually choose to act against the institution, okay. So, kaya naman, they don't um, they're not aligned with the ideas of the rational choice theorists that actually, sinasabi nila, diba, that actually behavior is predictable because everyone is expected to be rational. They are rational. But new institutionalists would say that that's not the case with institutions. There could be variations based on agency of people, okay, and based on of how the institution is managed or organized. So for new institutionalists, it is important to note that agency of actors is not based on self-interest, unlike what is proposed by rational choice theory. Their belongingness to the institution also matters. We always ask, for example, why do Harry Roque, a former law professor at UP and human rights lawyer, act this way now that he is part of the Duterte administration? It can be because of self-interest, but it can also be because he's just following norms and unwritten rules as a member of this administration. So, um, that is one note of new institutionalists on agency. So I'm not defending Harry Roque. It's just an example. Okay, like um, maybe it's because he wants something from the administration, or maybe he's just really imbibing, the rules and norms of this administration. So either way, normatively, or if we judge him, either way, he's enabling, okay, the whatever this administration does, he's enabling it. Okay. So again, that could be, a view from the new institutionalism lens. So new institutionalism places the analytical focus on the polity. So we said kanina that the focus is not just on individuals but on organizations. Okay, so now it's bigger in the case of the polity. So we can understand politics as comprising three separate components: politics, polity, and policy. The presumption is that the polity structures the inputs of social, economic, and political forces and has a consequential impact on the policy outcome. Okay, so we have political forces that influences the institutions that would then produce policy outcomes. Okay, so what are these political forces? Okay, so again, recall my example on the movie On the Basis of Sex. So there was a time when courts of law only uphold what is in the Constitution or what is explicitly said there or how is it interpreted. So Ginsburg and her team argued that there are many laws that discriminate on the basis of sex, meaning discriminates women specifically. So the word woman does not appear on the US Constitution, but there is the assumption of equality of men and women. Her campaign for these laws to be revised was not an isolated incident. It was a part of movements from the 60s where women, students, environmentalists claimed their position in the polity or the political system. So in this case, the political forces are, the protesters, um, the youth during that time, and even Ginsburg, because she's fighting, but in the realm of the legal institution. So they are the forces in the society that has influenced the political structure. So they have influenced the political structure such as the government, and in the case of Ginsburg, the justice system. The justice system would have been stuck as its judges are beholden to formal rules. Okay, so they would have ruled na, no, that is not a law on gender discrimination. We don't need to revise it. But because it's not just Ginsburg, it's not just the protagonist, but it's also other political forces. Okay, then um, there would there were changes in policy. So because of these forces, the institution was forced to change. These movements had consequent effects on policy. Now, gender equality is not just codified or recognized as constitutional. Equality was not just between men and women, but between and among genders. The U.S. Supreme Court has since legalized same-sex marriage in all the states in the United States. So as you can see, the focus on polity. When we say polity kasi, it's the political system, like all in all. If you remember Easton, it's the political system. The polity is the political system. So in the political system, you look at how different parts of the polity are relating to each other. So in institutionalism, it actually tells you that political forces, okay, such as, those parts of social movements, coalitions in the government, ganyan. These forces could affect the institutions and how they work. And if the institutions change, then the policy could change. So you could apply this actually to our dream maybe recently or now that there should be enough or there should be strong political forces that would force this institution, this government, right now that we have, this administration that we have, to change their policy or change how they think about the pandemic. So that's how it is. Okay, so institutionalism can lend you, a lens when you look at political structures or when you look at the government as institutions. Okay, so to summarize, okay, our discussion on the institutions then gave us the following elements. So you have formal institutions, you have informal institutions and conventions, and you have the norms and symbols embedded in them, and then policy instruments and procedures. Yung policy instruments and procedures would be the outcome of those stable recurring patterns of behavior. Okay? And then yung norms, yung symbols embedded in them can actually be, sabi ko kanina, di ba, the norms could be informal. The symbols embedded in them could be what the institutions, for example, in UP, it's honor and excellence. It's not a symbol, but it's something that we say to defend the position of the university or to define ourselves as part of the university. And you can actually be beholden by that symbol or by that idea of honor and excellence. You won't cheat on your exams because of honor and excellence. So that goes the same way in political institutions. Okay, so another idea is institutional autonomy. So institutions play a mediating role. So the simple model of politics we outlined here sees political and socioeconomic forces as the starting point of governance. We certainly are not proposing that institutions provide the fundamental dynamics of politics. Instead, think of them as the context of where and how politics takes place through stable recurring patterns of behavior. So we have discussed that already, that the institutions are the context of which, gumagalaw, kung saan gumagalaw yung mga political actors mo. At ito rin yung nag-shape sa mga behavior nila. So, other ideas from institutionalism are that institutions are not neutral arenas. Okay, we have discussed this. Institutions structure the access of political forces to the political process, creating a kind of bias. So they could shape actors' behavior, and they could initiate policy change and go beyond role as mediator. They are political actors in their own right. So institutions in general could have their own agency despite influences. So if you're reminded of the discussion a while ago about the justice system, like if the justice system wants to not be influenced by the society, because that's what they do, justices um, are they're said to uphold this idea that they should not be affected by the society unless it is really a revolution such that in the 1960s. Okay, but institutions can actually say like, no, I won't do that. Okay, because they can uphold what is the stable recurring patterns of behavior that they have, and they could choose not to be affected by political forces. Okay, so that's what they're saying. So they could initiate policy change and go beyond role as um, mediator. Okay, so pag sinabi kasing mediator sila, that institutions, it's where it happens, you know. Institutions is where governance and it's where political behavior happens. So meaning kung ano yung ginagawa ng mga tao, yun yung magiging forma ng institution. Okay, so for example, if the Filipinos for the longest time have condoned corruption, voted for corrupt officials, then that's the phase of the institutions that you have. Okay? But, sabi dyan, that's how institutions play a mediating role. It's just, it's just the arena where people vote. It's the arena where people have, political behavior. But um as you can see, they could be political actors in their own right. The government can actually be political actors in their own right. Ngayon, there's so much pressure for them to change their stance and approach to the pandemic, but they're not budging. It's still the ECQs, the GCQs, etc. because they can be political actors in their own right. That in itself can be a manifestation of the institution because they think that as leaders, they have the right to decide what will happen for the country in times of crisis. Okay, so they don't actually think about being participatory. So they can be political actors in their own right despite political forces. So of course, like the other approaches, we should also look at the limitations of the theory, or sorry, the approach. So first is there is a problem with the definition of the institution. So as you saw, we worked so hard to define it because it's really hard to define it. So according to the reading, it is really there is a danger of conceptual stretching if its definition is expanded. Second, though it is assumed that institutions must have started from somewhere, new institutionalism is at its weakest when trying to explain the genesis and transformation of institutions. Okay, so even though we have this theoretical idea of institutions coming from behavior of people, recurring behavior of people, new institutionalism cannot actually explain this genesis and transformation of institutions. And then third, institutional change can be through intentional design, by accident, or through evolution. Okay, so new institutionalism, however, cannot fully grasp these sources of institutional change. For, as we have seen, it is argued that the institution could shape human behavior through rules and norms. New institutionalism is criticized as exhibiting a rather structuralist logic in which actors are prisoners of the institutional context and the logics of appropriateness they define. As we have mentioned, it is said that institutions constrain behavior, thus leaving no room for human agency. So aside from new institutionalism, just basic new institutionalism, there are many new kinds or strains of new institutionalism. So there are many, but two of them are normative and rational choice institutionalism. So first, normative institutionalism. According to this, institutions influence actors' behaviors because they shape values, norms, interests, identities, and beliefs, thus simplifying political life. This is because it is easy to make decisions if actors are driven by institutional duties or what they ought to do for the institution. Second, rational choice institutionalism argues that within the context of institutions, people can still maximize their utilities, however constrained by rules and norms. So we now move on to representative works. So since this is very long already, so what we will do is just to um, have a quick background on these representative works, and if you're interested about them, you can find readings about them online. Okay, so first is Douglas North institutions. So North introduced institutions to neoclassical economic theory. Institutions for him are the rules of the game that constrains and shapes human interaction. As previously discussed, he also thought that informal norms of behavior is as important as the formal rules of the game. So March and Olsen in 1989, in their work Rediscovering Institutions, the Organizational Basis of Politics, posit that institutions are not just the context for political action. They can also be actors, as what we have discussed. The state itself or the government could shape behavior. Institutions can also explain political order. As we have said, institutions are stable, recurring patterns of behavior. Thus, the current form of our government, for example, is a result of these entrenched structures, routines, and attitudes. The study of institutions in this context can thus make us understand better political phenomena related to the current political order. Finally, they note different factors of institutional change. It may be due to the culture where the institution is embedded or contextualized. It could be slow but conscious change in routines that could affect bigger change later on and attention to different goals of an institution. Okay, so that's all for new institutionalism. So I want you to go back to the VLE and read the readings if you haven't read them. And there's also a reading there on using institutionalism, historical institutionalism, that could be an example in the Philippine context. So thank you very much for listening to this hour-long lecture. So I hope you learned something. I hope you took notes. And if you have questions, as usual, you can note them down, and we will discuss that in the synchronous session for this lecture. Thank you.